Hi everyone, I'm Martin Walsh and I'm presenting today for both of us, including Helle Goldman. When sea levels rose after the end of the last ice age, a population of African leopards was left stranded on the island of Unguja in the Zanzibar archipelago off the Indian coast of what is now Tanzania. The Zanzibar leopard was initially described as a subspecies of the African leopard, smaller in size and with more densely packed rosettes. More recent genetic research has shown that it falls within the range of variation of leopards on the continent, being close to other Tanzanian leopards, but also sharing some features in common with leopards in northeast Africa. Despite rumours and hoaxes suggesting otherwise, the Zanzibar leopard is extinct and probably has been for the last 2 decades or more. In addition to the usual underlying causes, human population growth and the consequent loss of leopard habitat and prey, its extinction was precipitated by the ways in which it was classified and its behaviour imagined by the colonial and postcolonial authorities. Different ideas about what constituted vermin were a part of this. The British anthropologist Edmund Leach described vermin as a, quote, major category of English animals which cuts across the others being pets, farm animals, game and remote wild animals. Leach's main interest was in the parallels between animal and social classification and the role played by anomaly in generating taboo, themes that were developed further in Mary Douglas's Purity and Danger. There's more to vermin, however, than being creatures out of place that some people dislike. As the dictionary definition makes clear, they are animals that are believed to harm human interests, including other animals that we perceive as beneficial. The British authorities in Zanzibar faced just such a question. Did leopards do more harm than good? Should they be protected or controlled, or some combination of both? The explorer Richard Francis Burton's double interest in the leopard's distinctiveness and destructiveness characterised British attitudes to it for most of the following century. At the time he wrote, Zanzibar was an independent sultanate, and the control of leopards and other wild animals was very much in the hands of islanders themselves, Arabs and other members of the elite who went hunting for sport, and the villagers who had most to fear from the island's apex predator. After Zanzibar became a British protectorate in 1890, officials took an increasing interest in the island's leopards. The first scientific specimen was sent to the British Museum in 1919 by William Mansfield Adams, the Protectorate's economic biologist. Like Burton, Adams noted how destructive leopards could be, adding gory detail to the description of how they were killed. He participated enthusiastically in the shooting of a trapped leopard in 1925, and this became a prime exhibit in the new museum in Zanzibar. A second skin was collected for the British Museum by another administrator in 1929. This was enough for the zoologist Reginald Pocock to classify the Zanzibar leopard in 1932 as a subspecies in its own right, Panthera pardus urdersi. The next 2 specimens went to Harvard Museum of Comparative Zoology, completing the colonial era collections. Growing knowledge of the Zanzibar leopard and its scientific classification as an island endemic did not spare it from local hunters and trappers. In 1919, Adams drafted legislation for the protection of some of Zanzibar's vulnerable fauna. The Wild Animals Protection Decree of that year forbade the killing of certain animals without the permission of the British administration. The Zanzibar leopard, however, was not placed on its schedule of protected species. Instead, and in order to help quell local concerns, the authorities supported the trapping and killing of problem leopards. In 1922, a file was begun in the Secretariat with the unambiguous title, Destruction of Leopards. It opened with a discussion of how much local leopard trappers should be paid and a decision to double their reward. And so things continued, more or less, for the next quarter century. The demonization of leopards by the British reached a climax in 1948, when the authorities had to respond to the worst case in modern times of what they described as a, quote, man-eating leopard. This was held responsible for the deaths of one woman and 3 children over a 7-week period between June and August that year. But despite the panic that this caused in the administration, official attitudes to leopard control had already begun to change. A few months earlier, the new senior commissioner, R.H.W. Pakenham, reported that, quote, the payment of rewards for leopards has been discontinued. The little harm they do to livestock is more than compensated by the number of vermin they destroy during the course of a year. End of quote. While working his way up the ranks, Pakenham had turned himself into an authority on the fauna of the archipelago, and he had collected the second of the 2 leopard skins and skulls that went to Harvard. After the 1948 panic, he continued to make the case that leopards did more good than harm by eating wild pigs, monkeys, and other crop pests. Leopards that developed a taste for livestock and their owners could be dealt with on a case-by-case basis. Pakenham's persistence prompted a debate about the classification of leopards. This drew in Zanzibar's top official, Vincent Glenday, who asked at one point, are leopards classed here as vermin? In reply, he was told that there was no such legal designation in Zanzibar, though leopards were treated as though they were vermin. As a result, in March 1950, the Zanzibar leopard was added to the schedule of the Wild Animals Protection Decree, meaning that in future they could only be killed using approved methods and with express permission from the senior commissioner. Relatively few permits were granted in the years that followed, though as nationalism grew and independence approached, the administration came under increasing pressure to issue more. The demand for action against leopards came from the rural population. Leopards were feared not just because of their occasional attacks on people and livestock, but because it was believed that rogue Felids were magically controlled by evil people, witches who shared in their ownership and used them to harass and harm their village enemies. The simplest local classification of leopards was a distinction between domesticated and wild leopards. Any leopard which approached human spaces and livestock was suspected of being a kept leopard, while unthreatening leopards encountered in the bush were presumed to be wild. Whereas villagers had once relied on their elders to propitiate community spirits and the leopards that lived in the same caves, they had become increasingly suspicious of people thought to possess this power. It's quite likely that the growth of human population and farming as the 20th century progressed underlay increasing conflict with leopards and exacerbated the social tensions that modern development inevitably brought. Following the economic sacrifices of the Second World War, villagers in the south of the island seemed readier than ever to take matters into their own hands. The result was a series of local initiatives against leopards and their keepers. The colonial authorities appeared to have been blissfully unaware that all this was going on, and that villagers were driven by fear of the leopard keepers as much as the leopards they supposedly kept. The world that Pakenham and his fellow officers had known came to an abrupt end on the 12th of January 1964, when the newly independent Zanzibar government was overthrown in a violent revolution. Union with Tanganyika to form the United Republic of Tanzania left Zanzibar with its own president and control over most of its own affairs, including wildlife. In the first years of Abeid Karumi's rule, matters were fairly chaotic. While colonial era legislation remained on the books, the revolutionary government slid back into treating the leopard as vermin. As part of a national drive to root out witches and other enemies of the state, Karume supported a national campaign to eliminate leopards and their keepers. This resulted in the killing of large numbers of leopards by hunters who believed in the efficacy of their own protective medicines. The campaign slowed down after the assassination of Karume in 1972, but the government-supported killing of leopards didn't stop. It continued as part of a more orderly effort to control wanyama waharibifu, destructive animals, in the name of national economic development. National hunters went out to the countryside every weekend, where they were joined by others in killing all the leopards, bush pigs, monkeys, and pythons that they could. The government paid their petrol, bought their bullets, and kept copies of their tallies of kills. When we began our research on the Zanzibar leopard in 1996, these hunts were still taking place, and they continued into the new millennium. The last official record of a leopard kill, however, was at Jambiani on the southeast coast in April 1995. By this time, Zanzibar had liberalised and opened up to environmental initiatives, the most prominent of which was the Jozani Chwaka Bay Conservation Project. As well as producing a flurry of studies of the Zanzibar leopard and other wildlife management issues, this resulted in the redrawing of relevant national legislation and the gazettement of new protected areas. Although belief in leopard keeping remained widespread, the Zanzibar leopard was at least protected again. There was even speculation in the national media that keepers might be persuaded to display their magically controlled animals for money. But by then it was too late for Zanzibar's leopards, whether kept or not. Despite the hope that some might have survived, all the experts now consider this island population of leopards to be extinct. We can't say that classification alone killed the Zanzibar leopard, but it certainly played a part in this endemic population's demise. And we can't say that the English category of vermin or its Swahili equivalent was the only one that mattered. The local distinction between wild and domesticated leopards added a dimension of moral judgment that was qualitatively different from any implied in official classifications. This is a world in which leopards can be kept and conjured up, whether or not they exist in the wild, a very different place from that known to Zanzibar's colonial rulers and today's zoologists and conservationists. And that brings me to the end of our presentation. I leave you with images of some of our other Zanzibar leopard publications and a link to one of the places where they can all be found, including shortly today's slides and speaking notes. And thank you all for listening.